we have Dr. Christopher Stuart with us, who is an assistant professor of communication studies at the University of North Carolina. He specializes in integrated marketing communication and design with research interest in game based pedagogy, game facilitation, and the rhetorics of possibility. And today he will be joining us online as he already have to discuss about the journey to the podium, breaking down the steps of conference presentations.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Just let me know if you cannot. Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So my presentation is Journey to the Podium, breaking down the steps of conference presentations. So before I get started, if anybody wants access to this presentation, and I also have a Word document in this folder as well. I'll show this code again at the end of the presentation, but I will be adding a couple more things to the document, other resources that might be helpful to you. But I want to get started by just kind of talking about why we're having this talk, why it's important to talk about what it means to present at a conference, how to get to that stage, best practices and all of that. I'm sure all of us have different experiences with conference presentations. Some of us have presented in front of peers and colleagues before. Some of us have gone to conferences. Some of us have positive experiences, maybe not so positive experiences, and some people have had very negative experiences. So there's this expectation of conferencing and presenting your scholarship, your research, your interests. But there's also this assumption that we know what we're doing, that we know how to present, how to put a presentation together, how to submit to a conference, how to find conferences. So this presentation is going to kind of walk through all of that. So just to establish some ethos, so I started doing presentations in my master's program at Eastern Michigan University. I was told that if you want to get into a PhD program, you have to have a bunch of conferences under your belt. I found out that necessarily was not true, but I started off strong and I did a lot of conferencing in my MA. I ended up helping plan and organize 4 different conferences over the last 6 or so years. And I've also facilitated dozens of professional development workshops on all different types of topics when it comes to the MA, the PhD, or being a junior academic. I've also delivered over 40 conference presentations and then a bunch of other presentations at local universities. And the one that I'm probably most proud of, I'm a game facilitator of over 160 tabletop role-playing game sessions. So think like D&D. But corralling a bunch of people together and keeping their focus for 3 hours or so at a time, largely strangers, and introducing all different types of systems and mechanics, it's a lot to facilitate. So I think conferencing, facilitating a classroom, a discussion, a workshop, all these things are related, which is why I present that to you here. So just as an agenda, what we're going to go over, again, why is this important? Why are we having this conversation? Where to start? Responding to a call to papers, preparing for your talk, presenting the visuals, and delivering your best talk. And Q&A is part of that. So I'm going to talk about tips and tricks and all of that related to conferencing. So let's start with why is this important? So like I said, not everybody has a positive conference experience, and there's a lot of times this assumption that we know what we are doing when it comes to conferencing, and that's not always the case. Different conferences have different expectations, different audiences have different expectations, and then there's also the expectation of your rank and what that means with your scholarship and how you're presenting. So we're talking about what informs best practices, but it's also a way for us to commiserate on experience. There will be time for some Q&A where, I very much so welcome your questions and comments and your concerns, but hopefully this generates a conversation with peers, with colleagues, with mentors, with your students, so you can really kind of express why this is important to have professional development sessions on. I also have resources that I am going to share. There are also, if you went to that website or a QR code. At the bottom of the document, there are some clickable resources. And again, trying to fight this assumption. So if anybody has seen 8 Mile or has followed Eminem, one of his most famous songs, he starts it by saying his palms are sweaty and these weak arms are heavy. The whole song, the whole movie is his progression into confidence. And it starts with him being so nervous and having so much anxiety to get on stage in front of people that he gets physically ill. And there's a whole bunch to his redemption arc and whatnot in the movie. But I've showed this to my students to get them to understand that, performance anxiety is a real thing and everybody handles it and deals with it in very different ways. So it's something that, again, we need to talk about. It can't just be the positive experience that we talk about. So to talk about why conferencing. So conferencing is really important for many different reasons, and it really depends on what your obligations are. So part of it is networking and professional development. So getting to, hear what people have to say and find like-minded people so you can collaborate with maybe depending on where you are in your career, maybe it's a way for you to explore other universities, other jobs, other positions, other fields, other disciplines. And then also professional development. Conferencing typically has a lot of professional development elements, such as this talk. Feedback on scholarship is another big part of it. Depending on the kind of conference you go to, hopefully you do have an audience, and that audience is going to be able to listen and provide feedback, and they're going to be an engaged audience. That's always the hope. I've definitely presented to an empty room or only one person or just the people on my panel. And, sometimes that happens. And then other times there's 200 people in the room. But getting feedback on scholarship is important. It also allows you to get a pulse on the discipline. Journals only do so much. Books only do so much because there's a much longer time in between the presentation, the current elements of the field and when that actually publishes. So going to conferences, you get to see all these new ideas, how people are using different theories, and really the evolution of the discipline. Also, there might be a contractual obligation as part of tenure or as part of your lectureship or whatever your position is. You may be obligated to go to conferences. Grad students may be obligated to go to conferences. And like I said, tenure. Conferencing may be a requirement of tenure. It might be part of tenure. It may give you, certain points or certain elements towards your dossier. But everybody has a different contract. Every university does things different, and every country does things different. So a lot of what I'm talking about is the experience from the American education system. But I have done a bunch of research on international conferencing, and I've presented at several international conferences. So hopefully it's generalized enough for everybody. Okay, so where do you start? So this is the question that I get all the time, especially from grad students. Where do I start? Where do I find these conferences? Where do I find these calls? So the first thing I always say is lean on your personal network. Social media is, for me, that's where I find a lot of my conferences because I do a lot of different things with game studies and pedagogy, and it helps a lot with leaning on my personal network, largely through social media, but also organizations. So ICA is a really good example. But other organizations that are specialized with your interest or your discipline, or maybe it is just kind of the catch-all generalist conference of your region, of your state, of your country, of whatever. Also lean on your colleagues. Ask your colleagues. If you're not sure, if you're not finding the conference calls that really call to you, that really speak to what you're trying to do, lean on somebody that is engaged in that field, engaged in that research. There's no shame at all in asking anybody, even a grad student that you heard that went to an interesting conference. Hey, where did you hear about that? That'll help so much when it comes to finding what really speaks to you when you're thinking about conferencing. Instead of just looking at like your personal network, you could also look for your niche subject areas and interest groups. So sometimes conferences will have a special interest group that is separate from the large conference call. They might have their own call. I know a lot of the conferences that I go to, the general conferences, the national or international ones, I always look to the special interest groups, because the special interest groups are where my audience is going to be. The people that are reading my scholarship, the people that are going to be co-authors with me are going to be in those areas. So I seek those out whenever I can. And then, of course, read as many calls for papers as you can. And more on that in a moment. So organizations and lists, the shared document in the folder with the QR code does have links to these. So you don't have to Google them. But International Communication Association, as you know, but they have a subscribable section of their website called The Link. And if you're not part of The Link, I highly recommend it because they have so many different calls and networks and forums and all different types of ways to network and communicate with the discipline. So I highly recommend that. ICA also has a call for papers page, which would also be greatly beneficial to anybody that is looking to align themselves with ICA. For me in the United States, the National Communication Association is where I lean on. They have their own listserv called ComNotes, the ComNotes list. It used to be called something else and it changed about 8 or so years ago, but ComNotes will list everything from journal calls, edited collections, conferences, workshops, all the way to obituaries. They kind of cover it all. You can subscribe to different elements, and it's really helpful. They do post international conferences as well. It's not just American conferences. Also, a lot of them now are hybrid and they offer remote presentations. And then there's also CFP or call for paper sites. So the one that I used a lot as a grad student was Calls for Papers UPenn. So University of Pennsylvania has a whole wiki site dedicated to this. It is largely humanities focused, but you can find some really amazing stuff in there. Again, not just conferences, but a lot of conferences get posted there, especially the more niche special interest ones. There's also Wiki CFP. That's more science focused. Though I know several communication scholars that use Wiki CFP, especially if they're doing things that are more science, more methodology focused, and they've had some great successes there. And then there's a general list, the cfplist.com. It kind of covers all disciplines. I haven't used it too much, but I've heard many people talk about this one. But I did a quick search a couple of days ago just for things on gaming, and there was quite a bit that came up that did not come across any of my network. So I was pretty excited about that. So you really want to ask yourself, do you want to find a conference theme? Do you want to find the discipline, or do you want to find the niche organization? That'll help you narrow down what you're interested in. And I do recommend reading as much as you can. So once you figure out your conference and you have to respond to the call, so how do you do that? When I teach my grad students about responding to a call, I tell them it is very similar to responding to a job ad. It's the same general rhetorical practices that you are doing. You are looking for an overall theme. You are looking for references. You want to find as many references as possible because that'll help you narrow down the scholarship, or at least what their stance is on that discipline or scholarship. Reference to different events, key terms. Key terms are really important because you want to use those key terms in your abstract or paper, or maybe even your title. And then also it'll give you, usually well-written calls will give you a lot of suggestions for topics. Usually at the bottom of the call, you'll find a dotted list with a bunch of different subjects that they are looking for, which I think is super helpful, especially if you are really needing to present at a conference. You find a kind of generalist conference and you're not exactly sure what to do. A lot of times they will give you plenty of opportunity to kind of think through all the different things that the committee is looking for. And then most important, it will give you guidelines. I cannot stress this enough. Give yourself enough time to present. Give yourself enough time to to write through, to research, to maybe find collaborators, to peer review, etc. But it's very, very important to read through all the guidelines, which I'm going to talk about next. Reading through the guidelines will save you a lot of time and effort, and it will also speed up the process, and it'll absolutely increase your acceptance rate. It shouldn't have to be said, but we're all busy. We're all trying to rush through things all the time, and that's understandable. But when it comes to presenting at a conference, especially one that has high rejection rates, you need to read the entire call and the submission document. If there's a special interest group, they may have their own submission requirements. They may have their own call. So it's important to read through the entire site. ICA site, NCA site, the really big communication association sites have fantastic calls, as well as submission guidelines. They cover it all. I didn't have a single question after reading through everything. I was a little bit intimidated when I was applying to some of these conferences because there are so many requirements, but I think that they are masterfully written. Always check deadlines. There might be several deadlines. There might be a deadline for an abstract and then a deadline for a paper. There might be a deadline for submitting a paper if you're applying for an award. Maybe it's just an abstract, for the first review. There's a lot of different deadlines that are listed on calls. Make sure that you read through and check those deadlines, whatever one applies to you. And then also, depending on the conference you're applying to, they may only require an abstract. Some ask for a paper. Others are asking for visual aids. It all depends on what kind of conference you're applying to. Usually the larger ones are asking for papers or at least extended abstracts. If you're applying as a panel, usually it's only an extended abstract and then a couple other submission requirements, but not papers from everybody. But it just depends on the conference. So make sure that you read all the guidelines. Also check for audio visual. I tend not to present at conferences that do not allow audio visual aids. I do not like to be a talking head on the screen without visual aids. I do not like to sit there and just read a paper to people. I want to have audio visual aid. So that is something that I always look for. And many conferences still do not have that. Also, look to make sure that it's face-to-face, online, or hybrid. And that is extremely important. If you are not intending on traveling there, you have to make sure that it is acceptable to be remote. If it doesn't say anything, you could always ask the conference organizer. But there are some conferences now that if you get accepted and don't show up, you kind of get blacklisted from that conference. And they will not entertain another abstract or paper from you. So it's very important to make sure that you find those guidelines and communicate with the conference organizer whenever you can. Also, there are student opportunities. If you're not a student yourself and you see student opportunities at a conference that you think would be interesting to your students, make sure that you reach out to them. The student elements, they typically have scholarships, they have awards, they have all different things that really boost a student's career and their chances into higher education. So I highly recommend sharing those opportunities. And finally, funding and scholarship and pricing. A lot of conferences no longer show that they are offering hardship or international scholarships or special funding. I found in my experience, if you reach out to the conference organizer after you've been accepted, sometimes before, it depends on how large the conference is. Sometimes they'll just waive your registration fee. Now, registration fees can be cheap. They could be, $20 US. They could be $1,200 US. It really depends on the conference. So every bit helps. So asking for those opportunities is really helpful, especially with students and junior junior academics, but it does apply to everybody. Sometimes they will offer for you to work the registration desk or to be a moderator or something like that to cover some fees. So always ask, always look for those opportunities. And then for larger conferences, they may have different submission guidelines. I have more listed on the shared document. But typically it's title, presenters, and the type of presentation, which is pretty typical. but some of them are abstracts, some of them are papers, some of them have a diversity of submissions, especially international conferences. Typically, if you're submitting as a panel, they want several countries represented. Or several regions represented, or different universities. Some of them will have different requirements like that. Some of them will have ethical statements. Some of them you have to write a statement to attest to something. Others, it's just ethical considerations. Usually you have to write out your keywords. This helps with indexing and creating their programs, but also helps with peer review and submissions. Many times you have to write a justification statement, especially if it's a panel, justifying that your panel deserves a spot at this conference for whatever reason. You really have to articulate how it fits their theme perfectly. Typically, it's a little bit easier to submit as at a larger conference. It's easier to submit as an individual. At a smaller conference, it's easier to submit as a panel, but it really depends on the conference. Anybody that you know that has attended or works a certain conference, definitely ask them for some insight on those conferences. That insider information can really help when it comes to allocating your time towards writing for a conference. And then, as I said multiple times, general versus special interest. Some conferences, if you are better off submitting to a special interest group, but you submit to the general call may just reject it because you didn't look at the special interest group. Sometimes they send it to the special interest group if they don't have enough submissions. So definitely look at those special interest groups and what their submission requirements are. Okay, so best practices when it comes to actually writing your submission. This is expandable to a paper, but abstracts are a little bit more concise and a little bit easier to kind of work through. I can spend an hour workshop on just going through how to respond to a call. And I do have some more information on this and some links to other resources on the shared document. But incorporating the theme and keywords in your response is really important. For some conferences, if you don't incorporate the theme or keywords, it's an automatic rejection. Others, they don't want you to have any keywords or the theme represented in your title, but they do want to see it in the abstract or the paper. So really read those guidelines. To structure your response, typically you want to talk about what the idea is and maybe some background. So if you're more of a niche specialist, you want to give more context. If you're talking about something that is not, headline news that everybody talks and knows about, then you want to give some more context. But you want to introduce your idea and have that background there. Then you want to move into methodology or theoretical framework. For somebody who doesn't do a lot of methods, it's usually rhetorical analysis on my part or ethnographic research. I typically bring in scholars that are helping me frame things. So I add that theoretical frame. Others, they want to see the exact method that you used and what area or what process you were currently in. Did you finish the study? Are you proposing the study? Where are you at with that study? Results, if you have results, or you can talk about it hypothetically, this study hopefully will do this. That is perfectly acceptable for these, largely because you are applying months in advance of the conference. And then you always want to end it with significance and takeaway. What will the audience take away from your talk? What will the audience take away from your presentation? I do this even for professional development. I will always say, I will have resources, I'll have a handout, they'll learn X, Y, and Z. I always make sure that I have that there. Not everybody includes that part. It's more of kind of a descriptive analysis. And for some conferences, that's okay. But for the more competitive ones, they want to see that significance or takeaway. So that's really important to make sure that is there. Most importantly, know your audience. How much background do you need to give on a topic? If it is for a special interest group, you probably don't have to give a whole lot of background unless you're doing something completely new. So really make sure that you know that audience. And then what is the common knowledge of the organization or discipline? Do you need to explain who Aristotle is when you're talking about Aristotelian rhetoric? Probably not, unless you're not applying to a rhetoric or communication focused conference. So make sure that you kind of understand what the organization or discipline is referring to as common knowledge, and the call typically helps a lot with that. Also, give your panelists enough time to contribute. You don't want to say, hey, the deadline is tomorrow, can you throw something together? Always proofread and review, have somebody else review your materials as well. It's very important to establish that element of peer review and being okay with presenting your work to others in written form and oral. Okay, so you get in, right? You're at the you're getting ready for the conference. Now you need to prepare for the talk. So what do? Similar to the abstract or the paper, you are writing for your audience. You are presenting for your audience. So who is your audience? Who do you expect to be there? If it's a special interest group versus general, or if you're totally out of your discipline, you need to make sure that you maybe have more establishing slides to give contextual information. Maybe you do need to explain that theory a little bit more, or the methodology. So really know your audience. Leave room for anecdotes or revisions. You don't want to write out and script an entire talk that you only have 15 minutes for, and you read it quickly and you're exactly at the 15-minute mark. That's not best practice. You want to be able to slow down. You want to talk so people can understand you and not speed through everything. But you also want to be able to add in other elements from the conference, like, oh, well, my presenter talked about this, and to add on to that, and then you can go that way. Or we've seen a lot of great presentations so far at this conference, for instance, and then you could go into that. You always want to leave a little bit of that room there. Read the paper, notes, and slide out loud. This is writing center and writing consultation 101. We catch a lot of our errors when we read it out loud. You don't want to read your presentation out loud for the first time in front of an audience. That's not very helpful, and you might stutter and stammer over some of the typos, some of the mistakes you've made. Timing yourself going fast and then talking a little bit slower or normal. This will help you simulate performance anxiety and nerves, and it'll make sure that your timing is right on point. You don't want to go over time. Make sure all technology is working as intended. Before this talk, my camera didn't work, my headphones died, and my light broke. So I'm glad that I came to campus at 4 o'clock in the morning to make sure that I had everything ready for my talk, because I had a lot of technology issues. Make sure your visuals are saved properly. Make sure they're downloaded or uploaded or whatever they need to be. Make sure your computer is charged and the power cord is accessible, your camera is operational, and your microphone is working. Of course, those last two are for remote presentations. Now for visual guide, I have a bunch of resources in the shared document, but just kind of best practices. Having a visual hierarchy, making sure we know what the title or subtitle is, making sure we know what the body content is, making sure we know what the sub-content is. Group your content together. You don't want to have things all over the place unless you're going for like a word cloud or collage. Be consistent in your design, same fonts, same colors. You don't want to have more than 2 fonts on really anything that you design, but you can play around with the weights of a font. Contrast is queen when it comes to color. I use this purple and white a lot because it makes it very easy to read. Black on white makes it very easy to read. Think about color blindness. Think about other accessibility issues. Contrast is really important. You don't want people squinting to try to read because you use this really strange yellow text on a white background, or red or green. Some of those colors are extremely difficult to read, especially on screens. Type should be easy to read all the time. You don't want to have the fine print unless it's meant to be fine print. You want things to be larger and accessible, especially because you don't know how large the screen is going to be when you are presenting. Be concise, simple, and brief on your slides. Having giant block quotes, having giant paragraphs are not great practice. No long videos or quotes. I went to a presentation just recently where somebody was supposed to present for 20 minutes and they showed a 10-minute video. And then they were like, oh, that was longer than I expected. And then they kind of stumbled through the talk. They went over time. It caused a whole problem for the panel. Don't show long video clips. Having long quotes could be okay if it's integrated into the talk well. but you don't want to just be sitting up there reading quotes. That's not fair to the audience. And then having sentence case versus capitalization is really important. Sentence case is, you only have the first word capitalized, or the first word of each line capitalized. But if it's all in caps, it makes it extremely difficult to read things, especially when it's more than just one word or a phrase. Yeah. So delivery. When it comes to delivering the presentation, this is where practice comes in. Your first conference presentation probably wasn't great, and that's okay. And we learn just by doing it. Understand that it's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to not be perfect. Nobody is perfect. Stuttering and stammering is acceptable and fine, as long as you are prepared. So make eye contact, vary your tone. You don't want to just read a paper and be super monotone. You're going to put everybody to sleep. And use body language. Hard to do online, but you can still do it. Try to be a little bit more dynamic. Don't be right up against the camera. Have a step back a little bit. And so they could see your body and just your movie. Even if your head is moving a little bit, if your eyes are moving a little bit, that makes a big difference. Like I said, don't just read your paper, present it. This is cultural, and this is also discipline specific. It's also certain conferences where you submit a paper and they expect you to read the paper. Others, no visual aids whatsoever, and they expect you to sit there and read a paper. Like I said, I typically avoid those conferences. That's not how I present. That's not how I do my scholarship. But if you do that, make sure that you're familiar enough with the paper that you can look up, that you can add anecdotes without getting lost and derailing your presentation. Make sure use visual aids if allowed. Like I said, make sure your tech works before the panel. Try to go in a little bit early. Make sure that your presentation actually pulls up. Always have a backup. Always have redundancies. Make sure a microphone is used if available. If there is a microphone in the room, even if it's for online only, maybe for a recording and there's nobody online at the moment, you still want to make sure that you are engaging in that way. And then reference conference, previous sessions, co-presenters, etc. Remote presenting, trial tech, like I said, limit background noise, limit echoes, use headphones if you can. Simple backgrounds, no backlighting. So, don't present in front of an open, bright window. And then make sure you're stable, your internet is stable, and always have a backup plan. It is so important to always have a backup plan. Finally, the part that a lot of people ask questions about, asking questions. One, always tell the truth. It is so easy to get caught up in the moment and try to sound smart and try to deliver something and say something that is just not true. You can easily get caught in a lie. You often be easily disproven. So just be careful about that. Always tell the truth. You also don't need to know all the answers. It's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to say, I didn't consider that. That is perfectly acceptable. And there are some people that sit in an audience that try to stump you. They maybe they're a narcissist that likes to hear themselves talk. So they're giving their own micro presentation that kind of is a question, but they're trying to stump you. They're trying to put you on the spot. It's okay to not answer a question. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You don't have to have all the answers. If somebody offers something that is helpful, say thank you. That was helpful. Write it down. Take notes. That kind of thing. And then talk with the chair or moderator about Q&A strategies. So if you have a chair or a moderator, you can say, hey, if somebody asks like a ridiculous question, are you going to step in, or is that on me? Who's going to choose who asks questions and all of that? And I have this in the guide as well, but I'll go over this very quickly. It is good practice to repeat the question. Thank you for the question. So if I heard you right, you are asking this. That is a really good way to buy yourself some time to think about what you want to say, but it's also good to repeat the question in case other people couldn't hear it. You could also admit that you hadn't thought of that before. So thank you for the question. I hadn't thought of that while preparing for this presentation. And then you can pause and move on to what you think your response should be, or you can just say, I haven't thought of that, and I'll look into that. The micro presentation, the person that asks a question with their own kind of presentation, you can say, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that. What was your question? Or was there a question in what you were saying? Or I'm sorry, can you please repeat the question? You don't have to be passive aggressive. You don't have to attack them. You can just simply ask them to restate the question. And then also you can shut things down. If somebody asks something that's not appropriate, or if they're being hostile or whatever, you can absolutely shut a question down. You can say, I'm sorry, I don't think that is an appropriate question for this panel or for this presentation. I'm sorry, I don't see what the question has to do with this panel. And then if it's really egregious, there's other things that you can do and say. But I think answering questions, and people get a lot of anxiety about being asked a question, being off script. But it doesn't have to be scary, and you can definitely buy yourself time through a lot of these strategies. So thank you, everybody. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you. If you have any questions that you would like to email me, you can absolutely email me at stuartc@uncw.edu. And again, this is the QR code or the short URL if you would like to see if you'd like to have this presentation, or if you would like to see the additional resources.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stuart, for this enlightening and thought-provoking session. Now we will have a very quick Q&A session because our next presenter is waiting. We have one question from the audience. Can someone please pass her the mic?
Hi, Dr. Stuart. Thank you so much for such a helpful presentation. So I have a question about networking at conferences. So how can one make the most out of the networking opportunities at a conference?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Depending on where you are in your career, some conferences will actually have networking events. Others will have roundtable discussions where it's a little bit more conversational, where you can really get to know that scholar. And then, of course, there's always socials that you can attend. So to make the most of it, if there's anybody on the program that you absolutely want to meet, go to their panel, introduce yourself, connect with them in some way. Find them on LinkedIn, follow up after the conference. Hey, I saw you after my panel, after your panel. We had a really good conversation. Thank you so much for the resources, whatever it is. But always following up makes a big difference. I've met many, many different scholars and kept in contact with them by sending that follow-up email. But going through the program is really good, but if you find somebody at the conference that you hear them talk, or somebody mentions them and you're like, yeah, I really would like to go speak to them, try to find them at a social, at a networking event. And if you know any colleagues that personally know them, ask for them to introduce you. And again, always follow up. You can exchange cards. If you have cards, you could exchange social information, emails, etc., and always follow up. Do not wait for that scholar. Even if they say, I will send this to you, follow up with them, because you're the one that sought them out. So that, the short of it is always follow up and seek them out, look through the program ahead of time. But there's a lot of different strategies at different conferences, depending on how it's set up. But going to the social can be really, really helpful, because a lot of people's nerves are at ease because the conference presentations aren't happening. So everybody's in a more casual element, and it's much easier to have that conversation. So thank you for that question.
The academia in Pakistan, now they are facing two new hurdles in their journey to the podium. One is, the visa problem. The paper is accepted, but they have to face the at the 11th hour their visa is rejected. Now ICA, AEJMC, NCA, they are playing their role in making the visa confirm and showing up to the conference. But if an academic is done with this hurdle, then there comes another problem, and that is more grave. It is funding issue. So I think we need to make and raise a new movement in the Western world, that because most of ICNCA and even AEJMC, IEMCR workshop with conferences, annual conferences, they are occurred in technologically advanced countries. So I think we should try to there should be a movement that all these forums, they should at least 8 to 10 scholarships they should, spare for the scholars from the global south whose papers are, of good quality. They should go through some process, and there should be 8 to 10 scholarships or fundings for the scholars of the global south, so that, because now after this COVID issue, there are remote presenting there is the concept of remote presentations, but still I think there is a big problem in this type of presentations, like networking is not possible. When somebody physically show up in these conferences, they have more chances to share their ideas with. So it's not a question, it's a humble suggestion, from particularly from the scholar of the global northern countries, that they should try to convince heads of these international platforms that they should think on these lines and try to come up with the solutions to address this very growing issue with the scholars of the global south. Like, they are short of fundings, scholarships, and similar problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just to respond to that extremely quickly, absolutely. Remote presenting has made things easier to get voices out there that typically would not be able to have their voice heard. However, yes, networking and everything is extremely difficult when it is remote, especially when you're remote and other people are not. I know that some of the large conferences that have international counterparts, like Rhetoric Society of America, Rhetoric Society of Europe, etc., NCA, ICA, they've started doing more regional hubs, but that doesn't solve the problem, because then you're only speaking to your regional hub. There are a lot of talks about having more funding, more scholarship, and all we hear constantly is we don't have the money for that. We barely have enough money to put on our conference and everything else. There's a big push, especially from younger scholars, on older leadership, to prioritize international voices, to prioritize hardship funding, to prioritize things with visas. That conversation is happening, and it's a loud conversation at a lot of these conferences. But I mean, most of the voices that are advocating for this don't have the power to change things. So yeah, I know that NCA, there's a large group that is really fighting for more international funding, whatever that would be, waiving registration fees, whatever. But yes, that is a conversation that's happening, and I'm hopeful within the next couple of years we're going to start seeing more of that. But COVID slowed everything down, and it set us back a lot with conferencing. But hoping for the future. I'm sorry if things cut out there at the end. It seems like just with the Q&A, like the screen keeps freezing a little bit. But if you didn't hear the whole response, I'm hopeful. There's a lot of people that are fighting for it, especially at the larger national, international conferences that are associated with America. So we're hopeful for the future. COVID did set us back quite a bit, but we are hopeful. And thank you for making that statement.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stuart. We deeply appreciate your time and effort in sharing your knowledge with us. And we do hope that we will see you one day in Pakistan as well, in FCCU. And thank you so much for your time. That was amazing.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody.